Today, we're working on conflict. Welcome to Working On It, the podcast that helps you navigate the complexities of the work environment. I'm Lauren Spearman, brand consultant and advocate for care, flexibility and transparency at work.
And I'm Molly Johnson-Jones, CEO and co-founder of Flexa. We're here to provide you with practical advice, share real-world experiences, and hopefully offer a little bit of guidance of navigating the workplace.
Things might get a little feisty today because we're talking about something that affects workplaces everywhere, conflict. We're going to explore how to handle difficult colleagues, how to navigate it when you're the one being disliked, and also how you can manage tension as a leader.
It's a subject that's relevant to everybody, whether you're a seasoned professional or just starting out in your career.
Should we dive right in?
Yeah, it's one that's going to make me feel really seen because my friends always joke that I only like about 0.01% of the population. So it talks about conflict.
How many people are you? Well, okay, in that case, let's talk about disliking a colleague. I feel like you can maybe have a few stories on this. When we talk about conflict at work, what are the common reasons why that might occur?
Well, I guess pretty similar to why you would dislike somebody that you meet anywhere. Personality clashes, probably one of the biggest ones. People are naturally competitive at work, so competition around I want to be seen as the best person doing my job. Or somebody, taking credit for other people's work and trying to make themselves seem better than they actually are. Different communication styles or poor communication, some people just are very different to each other. And same with differing work styles, like whether it's a different management approach or different way of approaching tasks, whatever it might be. And I think natural, just social differences as well.
For me, it feels as you were talking about that, the communication one and the differing work styles for me have probably been the most common. Unlike you, I do like a lot of people. And generally, I don't think people are bellends for the sake of being it. I think there's often a bit of a reason behind it.
Whether or not I can put up with that is a different question.
And I guess there's loads of ways you can cope with those, right? In my experience, when it comes to conflict with a colleague, the best way is to sit down and talk. I think especially in the
What do you say in that environment? I hate you. I think you're a terrible person.
No, I'm thinking that. Yeah, I guess the best way I think is when you address it directly, it's so much harder to be confrontational in person. I think often you can hide behind blunt messages, email, Slack, etc., or hearsay. But when you sit down with a goal that we're going to get to a solution, rather than this isn't about us nitpicking, this is about how we're going to get to a good place with an end goal.
Did you feel like the reason that you could sit down with them, did you sense that they knew that there was animosity there as well?
Yeah. So I can think of two examples that where I've had conflict at work. One was with someone who was a peer. We were the same level. And I could sense very early on that he was frustrated with me because his team were coming to me for advice because I had more experience in the area that he led. And also I want to help people. I'm a nurturer at work. And I think he felt quite threatened by that. So my approach was quite collaborative. His was absolutely harsh. I got to the point where he presented in a meeting in front of me and my peers. So we were all the same level. He presented to us what he thought the team structure would be. And I wasn't in the structure. My team were reporting into him. And I was
a little organisational chart without you.
And I was like, wow. I was like, I didn't realise I was leaving because I was like, I can't not call it out in the meeting, but I don't want to make too much of a thing of it. So I called it out, and then behind the scenes, other people WhatsApp me going, what the hell's going on? And I think that was a straw. There'd been a build-up of tension, but I was like, you're trying to undermine me, and that's not cool. And I'd gone to my boss about it, and she was like, just almost fight it out between yourselves.
Yeah. So
I proposed that we have a meeting, and unprofessional me wanted to just get it all out and be like, I think you're being absolutely unreasonable.
Yeah.
But professional me was like, I need to go at it with, this is where we need to get to, how are we going to get there? And it was really interesting. We sat down and his tone was so different because we were in person rather than over email.
And that can definitely make a really big difference. I think generally conflict is much easier resolved face to face or even
Yes.
on a phone call
I think so.
than it is writing.
It was really interesting because I had prepared myself so much of what's the goal, how do we get there? And he kept bringing it back to, well, so-and-so said this. And I was like, oh, great. Could
one
you,
of my least
or like
favourite
someone
things.
said, and I was like, oh, could you give me an example? Because I'm not familiar with that. You couldn't give me any examples. It was all just like made up, whatever.
People don't like standing by their own opinions. They like saying, oh, but this is everyone, to try to make you feel nervous and undermine you.
Yeah, I think so. And eventually, like we said, look, we kind of agreed on a few things that we would do very soon after he left. So I didn't really have to deal with the fallout too much. But I guess my approach to it was think solution led.
Yeah.
Like this isn't, you're not going to get as much as you want to, you're not going to get anything out of it from just picking at someone. And then another example I have is someone that was more junior than me. Their behaviour had been inappropriate in a situation. And actually
What had they done?
Been incredibly rude to the point where HR was involved.
Wow.
And fair play to them. They came to me and was like, I'd like to discuss this. And I think I would hazard a guess they'd probably been encouraged to speak to me about it. As I said in an earlier point, I don't think that many people are bad people, just sometimes they behave in ways that aren't appropriate. And we sat down and they explained, like, what we kind of skirted around it a little bit. It was quite uncomfortable. And I was like, look, let's talk about the elephant in the room. What happened in that situation? Tell me from your perspective. And actually, what I learned in that situation was there were things going behind the scenes I didn't know. And it didn't necessarily mean that their behaviour was okay, but I understood where. And I'm someone, you know this, like I'm all about honesty and transparency. And I was like, if I'd have just known that, or you'd have come to me saying, I'm struggling with this, rather than just bottle it up and then blurt out, I could have been helped. So it was a really lovely conversation. And we said, right, we're going to be in a similar situation in a couple of weeks' time. What are we going to do? And again, it was just very solution driven. So my approach is always, where do you want to get to? And try and talk in person.
I think that's good advice. But those are two situations where people chose beef with you. What if you choose beef with someone else?
I feel like you're better placed to answer this.
I don't know. I've had a couple
Just
of
pick one
situations.
example.
Just one where I've decided that I really dislike someone. I've probably had like notably 3 examples. Some are more two-sided than others. One where somebody chose to have beef with me, one where I just really disliked a colleague, and another one where I just really, really, really didn't get on with the manager at all. She was publicly very rude about me, which is an interesting one to... I've actually never sat down with somebody and resolved it. I've kind of been
your
like...
manager?
She was indirectly my manager. So that one's a really interesting one. So I was at a company where we'd speak on the news quite a lot. So like covering different companies, then you go and comment on BBC News and talk about it. And I was on BBC Breakfast talking about supermarkets, and I went on wearing black, and the woman that was already there that was also on it with me was already wearing black. So they were like, you need to change. And I was like, I haven't got anything else. And they're like, did you have like a jacket or a blazer you came in with? And I had this like bright yellow blazer, like long sort of duster coat. And they were like, can you keep that on so you look different? And I was like, yeah, sure. And it went really well. And it was the first time that the company had had any of their analysts on BBC Breakfast. And this woman was in her mid-60s and wasn't performing brilliantly, let's say. She'd been at a very similar level for like a very, very long time.
Yeah.
And I came back from it, and then the BBC clip went live, and there was a company-wide email that went round like, oh, this is amazing. You know, we've been on BBC Breakfast, great recognition for our company. And she replied to the whole company, interesting outfit choice. To the whole company.
I feel like that response is something you'd imagine someone would forward to someone else.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not saying it's okay to say that.
To one person, to the whole company. And I was like...
The secondhand embarrassment that other people would feel reading that.
I know.
And what happened in that situation? What did you say?
So I then replied all to everyone, and was like, the BBC asked me to wear that and nothing else. And everyone got the email again, and you could just hear this caggling around the whole office. There were like, honestly, like 1,000 people on that email. And I just,
But
I wasn't like, X person, can we sit down and talk about this? I was just like, fuck you, and ignored her. Never dealt with her again.
So you I love that reply. What was the fallout of that? What happened next? How did you deal with that?
It was one of those ones where I sort of just moved on and forgot about it. Like, it kind of, what that taught me was that some people can have really personal gripes at work, and I didn't want to dig into why she sent that. I didn't really care that much. I was just quite shocked when it came through. So I was just like, well, people can get quite personal at work, and I hadn't really experienced that before. And it just seemed so petty. Like, this woman was 65 and I was 23. Like, it just seemed very petty. And it made me realise that, even though you can expect professionalism from some people, you're not always going to get it.
No, and I think people sometimes can't kind of separate that. She may not be the biggest fan of you, but professionally, that's not the way to behave.
Exactly. And it's just very unprofessional behaviour. And I think often that can happen in work scenarios. And I think if people react to it every time it happens, then sometimes, she could have just been having a bad day and just sent it without thinking.
Yeah.
Whereas making those things into, like, if it was repeat behaviour, I would have addressed it. But sometimes people just do something stupid.
But I also think it shows a little bit of self-awareness that even if she had done it and then reflected a few days later and was like, oh, that's not cool.
Yeah.
But just clearly
nothing.
Didn't give a shit.
She's upset under the rug too.
Yeah, I've definitely sent like quite blunt emails that I'd rather not. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's very easy to, in conflict, react in the heat of the moment and not think, oh, I'm at work. Because I think naturally when you're at home or you're in a relationship with somebody or it's family, obviously they understand you. They have all of the context of your life. They love you, whereas your colleagues don't love you. They don't have any fond emotion towards you. So you need to reconsider like how you react emotionally, because when you are in a situation of conflict, you get really frustrated with somebody. It's very easy to just knee-jerk react.
Yes. So I'm from a family where we'll get it all out our system. Yeah. And then 5 minutes later, it's like, do you want a cup of tea?
Yeah.
And I think in my early career, that's how I behaved at work. Like I'd blurt it all out or I'd bash it out in an email. And then I'd be like, well, I've said it, now it's done. And actually, I went on one of the best training I ever did at work was an emotional intelligence course.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest things I learned was I have no idea what is going on in someone else's life. And someone may be a dick, but actually that may be because there's something else going on or they're having a bad day. And equally, I don't expect myself to be perfect all the time, so I can't put that pressure on someone else. I think that one of the biggest lessons is like give yourself breathing space. So whether that is literally physically walking away from your desk and going out for 5 minutes, whether it's counting to 10, whether it's just saving the email in drafts or sending it to someone else to have a read through. I think often when we give ourselves space and then we come back on it, you're often like, would I really send that?
Yeah, taking a step back and making sure that it's not your emotions driving your decision or your approach. And I think naturally there is going to be emotion involved. It's impossible to not have it. But making sure that that's not the overarching thing driving your response.
Yeah, I hold my hands up. Like I'm still not perfect at that, of taking the emotion out.
It's hard.
But I think it is really important. It's like, look at the facts, not just this feeling you have.
And I think particularly if somebody is acting slightly out of character, is if you know that they're not normally like that, but they're suddenly really frustrating you, or they've suddenly done something you think is really unacceptable, but you've never seen that in them before, then it's sending them a level of grace and kindness, in the sense of like something must be driving your behaviour if you're not always like this.
But I think it works both ways, in that if I felt like I had been inappropriate or I'd spoken out of turn because I had something going on, I'm a bit of an open book, so I'd probably say, sorry, I've got this going on or whatever, or sorry, you don't have to go into detail, but I think there's also power in apologising when you're in the wrong as well.
But I find it really interesting. There's been a bit of a trend, like I don't know if you've seen it on social media, where people at work have stopped apologising so much, where it's like people, if they're late, won't go, sorry, I'm late. They'll be like, you should say, thanks for waiting for me. Or when you've done something wrong, it's not going, I'm sorry for how I behaved. It's like, I could have handled that better. And I find that really interesting because I think apologising is really powerful. If you are late, that's a you problem. Like, it's not, you can't blame an external factor. Like, even if your other meeting ran over, you should still say sorry to those people because it's not their fault.
And there's still maybe a reason out of your control, like the train broke down, but you can still apologise.
You still apologise. But there's this interesting thing, and I think it's particularly because there's a whole other topic about like gender inequality at work, but I think it's particularly been slightly commandeered by women because we naturally apologise for so much that it's like, oh, now I'm going to apologise for nothing. Whereas actually there's a balance between the two things. Like, we still do things wrong and we should still extend an apology or say sorry for something, not totally avoid the word because we find it disempowering. I definitely think I used to be an over-apologiser, but now I still think it's important. It's powerful. If someone's like, I was having a really bad day, I'm sorry for snapping at you, that means a lot more than going, I was having a bad day and nothing else.
I wonder if just on that point on saying sorry, I think it's the point on gender, I think I definitely have seen this, a lot of people kind of writing an email, stripping it back. And I think there's a big difference between sorry for doing something wrong and saying, oh, sorry, do you mind if I ask this? That's when you take out the sorry, because it's okay to ask people questions. But I don't think we should eradicate the word completely.
No, especially not in resolving conflict, because it's one of the most powerful words that you can use if you know that even if only 20% of a conflict was your fault, you can still apologise for your 20% in it. And then if the person who was 80% doesn't then apologise, then you can be really angry about it because you move first.
And the big golden rule is never say sorry you felt like that.
Oh my God, it's the worst. Sorry I made you feel like that. You're basically saying to somebody, sorry that you can't cope.
Not that you're sorry for what you did. You said you got a couple of examples. What else can you share?
I had another one where I just really, really just disliked the colleague that I was working with. She was terrible. But personally, we wouldn't have got in either. It was both in a work setting and a personal setting. Like, we wouldn't have ever been friends outside of work. Whereas I think sometimes you can be in situations where you could really like somebody, but then in a professional setting, you're just not very good at your job, or you have to pull them up on something.
Or similarly, it can work the other way. Like, I had a boss once that it's not like I didn't get on with them. I just found them so cold.
Yeah.
But professionally was probably empowered me the most. And some of my proudest work has been in that period.
Yeah, exactly. So it can kind of go either way. And I think with this girl that I was working alongside, she was not quite my peer, but like not significantly more junior than me. But she kept taking credit for work that I was doing, which was doing my head in. But I also wasn't going to go and have a conversation with her, because that's not, when I'm managing somebody or multiple people, then I would very much have an open conversation like that. But I would struggle in that scenario to sit somebody down and be like, let's behave like adults here.
Yeah.
That's just not really my personality. I'd rather either ignore it or choose to take a different pathway. So I ignored it for quite a while, and she kept taking credit for my work, and then she got promoted to the same level as me, even though our experience was vastly, vastly different, and we were being charged out at completely different rates to clients as well, which obviously very bad. And I brought this up then with the people that are running the company, who are also my managers. And they said, well, we wanted to promote her. And I was just talking about the fact that it's very unequal if you're charging me out to clients as more, but you're paying us the same. But her way of taking credit for work and making it seem like it was all her had obviously really worked on them. And I was like, I can't change this. And so I left at that point. And that was after like a year and a half of being at that company. I was like, because it was really small, there were only 7 of us there. I was like, if I really dislike one person there, and she's obviously very happy and thriving and they think she's great, I was like, I'm not going to change the course of these events. Like, I might as well remove myself from this conflict.
Is that an environment that you want to be in?
Exactly.
I guess that's a good point, actually, because it's scale, right? A small person, seven person business, you're obviously going to be very close to each other in the day-to-day. Whereas
you can't take yourself away.
A huge corporation, if it was that bad but you love the company, could you move teams? Or, could you kind of put yourself in a position where you don't have to be with them day to day?
Exactly. And I think when it's a really small company or a really small team, you can't really do that. You either need to choose if you want to be there or not. But yeah, if it's big, you're a team of 30 people, don't sit near them, try not to be on projects with them, ask to move teams. Like, there are loads of practical ways that you can kind of move on, I think.
Yeah.
And actually deal with the conflict without necessarily having to tackle it head on. Because I think a lot of people in those environments, like particularly when there's probably younger people listening, like when I was in my early 20s, even mid 20s, I wouldn't have felt comfortable like trying to tackle that conflict because I wouldn't have had enough awareness of my strengths, my weaknesses, like how I should behave in that scenario.
Yeah, I remember once, and it's interesting, I probably wouldn't do this now, but I remember once I was in a sales role, and just as I was leaving, I was in a meeting where I pulled up the fact that I was the biggest sales earner or something. It wasn't in a show-off way, but I was trying to get everyone else to be like, what's going on? And I got called the C word.
What?
Yeah, I got called the C word.
What was the context?
So we were talking about like sales targets and figures, and I was like, okay, well, I brought in this much, blah, blah, blah. And I think because I'd been consistently bringing in a lot of the revenue, it was seen as like I was showing off. And yeah, they were like, you don't need to be about it. And I was like, whoa,
Jesus.
okay. And my boss did nothing about it. And, I love to swear, but I would never swear at someone at work.
No.
So yeah, I found that completely inappropriate. I
Yeah,
guess
that's wild.
There's also just thinking about signs that colleagues dislike us. There's obviously very obvious things like, to your example, criticism, excluding you from things. I guess where do you think it draws the line between someone not liking you and bullying?
Yeah, I think that's a really tough distinction to make, although it shouldn't be like it.
Yeah.
But I feel like once you're into noticing it's bullying, you really are. But where does it cross over?
Yeah.
I think if it's repeat behaviour that is intended to undermine you, I think that's where it really does constitute bullying. I think, there's a difference between giving constructive feedback and, repeatedly trying to highlight performance issues. And that, I've heard of scenarios where some people have claimed that that's bullying, which I think is very difficult because you should be, as an individual on the receiving end of feedback, you should be able to distinguish when somebody is giving you feedback because you need to change rather than then trying to blame the person that's giving you the feedback for bullying you.
Yeah.
And I think that can really muddy the waters quite a lot when it comes to conflict because some people just aren't very good at looking introspectively and going, there is a problem here and I am contributing to it versus trying to blame somebody outwardly. But bullying also happens all the time at work. I think it's the undermining, it's the repeat nature of it. It's the intention to make somebody feel uncomfortable because of who they are, not necessarily what they're doing. Yeah,
if you're not making it about the work, and it comes down to the earlier point about why people clash, if it's personality-wise, that's very different to performance. But I also think that if someone's critiquing your performance, then to your point about introspection, like, is that relevant? If someone's going, you're consistently not delivering things on time, then and they're saying it over and over, is that bullying, or are they actually you are not hitting deadlines?
And is that conflict? It's only conflict depending on how you take that information. Like, I'm sure we've both had plenty of times where we've been told X needs to change or you need to improve this. I wouldn't see that as conflict. I'd see that as normal management.
Yeah, you've got to welcome feedback, right? Otherwise you're never going to grow and learn. And then in terms of, like, I guess, coping emotionally with things, like I don't know about you, I absolutely can't separate work and home life in terms of I can't just compartmentalize and then leave things at work. What coping mechanisms, I guess, for me, it's always talking to friends and family.
Yeah. Talking about it, I think, is really, really important. I think working out how you work best as well. So, like, I'm the same. I find it easier not to have boundaries in terms of, like, I'll be working for really, really long periods of the day, but I'll be going to the gym, I'll be walking the dog, whatever it might be, and online. And then also I like to get on with the people that I work with.
Yeah.
Whereas some people don't care at all. They're like, no, work is work, and I just go in to do my job, and I don't mind who I'm working with, and then I go home and I have a completely different life. So it's knowing what you want and where you work best, I think, is really, really important. And again, that kind of introspection of what works for you. And then I think if there is conflict going on at work, how you emotionally cope with that, to your point, talk to people, don't let it eat you up, I think is really important, because I think some people get very, very anxious about it because you have to go back to it day in, day out, but making sure that you've got some form of actionable plan, whether you have chosen to totally disregard it and move on, or whether you go and talk to HR, or whether you go and talk to the individual or talk to your manager. You need a plan for what you're going to do rather than just leaving it to eat away at you.
Yeah. I think it's to try and nip things in the bud as soon as possible is always the best approach.
Exactly.
This is a quick reminder that you're listening to Working on It, the podcast that unpacks the trials and tribulations of today's working environment, with me, Lauren Spearman.
And me, Molly Johnson-Jones. Now it's time for a quick break.
Motherhood isn't easy. The daily struggles, the worries, the mum guilt, and the unending demands can be overwhelming. We want to introduce you to Mindful Mamas, the maternal mental health app for every stage of the motherhood journey. Founded by a psychologist, Mindful Mamas created the first programme that spans the entire life cycle of motherhood, from trying to conceive through to empty nesting. Cultivate peace and serenity in your daily life, enjoy more restful sleep, strengthen the connection with yourself and your family. Whether you have 60 seconds or 10 minutes, the Mindful Mamas app offers sips of self-care anytime, anywhere. Mindful Mamas is dedicated to creating happy, healthy and thriving mothers worldwide. Join over 350,000 mums who have found strength with Mindful Mamas and make mental well-being a priority. Your family doesn't need a perfect mother, they just need you. We have a special offer for our listeners today, so to claim your 1-year subscription for just $29, email support@mindfulmamasclub.com and mention code WOI29.
Coming up, we're going to discuss managing team conflicts as a leader. But first of all, let's explore a real-life scenario of conflict from a listener.
This story comes in from Alex in Birmingham. Alex writes, I work in a mid-sized tech company and we have this one colleague, let's call him Bob, who's always been difficult to deal with. Bob and I have clashed on several projects because he tends to take credit for ideas that aren't his. Oh, I hate this. I hate Bob already. Last month, things came to a head during a team meeting when Bob presented an idea I had shared with him privately, claiming it as his own. Oh, we all know a Bob.
Yep.
It caught me off guard and my instant reaction was to call him out right there. It led to a heated argument in front of the whole team, and now the office feels like a battleground. How can I resolve this conflict and restore a positive working environment?
Tricky, because Bob is
so
in
many
the
people.
wrong.
Yeah.
But calling somebody out in a meeting was not the right way to go about it, in my opinion.
I disagree.
Fight.
Yeah. There's a bit of conflict on this, Molly. Why do you feel like it was wrong to call Bob out?
Not necessarily wrong to call him out, but the fact that it then led to a heated argument. So like you can call somebody out gently, I think, and say, oh, really interesting, building on what we talked about before when we first discussed this idea, whatever it is, to do it subtly. But my reading of this is that the way that they called him out then led to an argument that they then engaged in, which I think in a professional scenario, it's always better to try to take a step back from it, because you're never going to come out of that well if you're in a big fight in a meeting.
Yeah, I guess ultimately, if it's a recurring, I do wonder if it's a recurring thing. It's just very hard though, isn't it? Yeah. I think someone's taking your ideas as their own happens a lot.
Yeah, and it's a horrible thing to have to go through.
But I am maybe on Alex's side a little bit, because it's probably the bubbling up of emotion that gets frustrated.
I'm definitely on Alex's side over Bob's. I just think there's a better way to deal with it.
Yeah. I have my own Bob in a story where a colleague, actually one that I mentioned the conflict earlier, you may have noticed I'm a bit of a waffler when I talk, and often in brainstorms when we would have in meetings, when I share my thinking, I share the thought process of my thinking to get to the answer. And a few of us were like that when we ever did these brainstorms. And this one guy, he, as much as I really disliked him, he was amazing at taking what someone had said and just saying it in 3 words or a couple of sentences. And so often he would get the credit for things because he just said it so sharply. It just sounded really well packaged.
Frustrating, yeah.
And I found it so infuriating. What I did find though is my other colleagues had noticed it, and actually we kind of got together and would be vocalizing that in meetings. Yeah. So, say one of my colleagues had said something and then he summarized, and then my boss would be like, oh, well done, so-and-so. And I was like, oh, it's like so, or we'd start getting into a habit of going, oh, it's like so-and-so mentioned earlier. So try to nip it in the bud.
Which I think is a good way of calling that behaviour out, because it's gentle and it's professional and it's highlighting an issue. But if you'd gone, no,
you're wrong.
I said that, you've just summarised it, that wouldn't have gone down particularly well in that scenario. It's a gentler, more professional way of handling it.
If Alex hadn't got to the point of a heated argument and was, I guess, addressing this directly with Bob, I guess you'd probably want to go with examples, right? Because if you just say to someone, oh, I feel like you're just stealing my ideas, they'd be like, well, no, I'm not. Whereas if you have a little bank of evidence to go, oh, on this occasion, without trying to be too accusatory.
Yeah, I think that's probably the right approach. Even in this, where Alex is asking, how can I resolve this conflict and restore a positive working environment? I think sitting down and having a conversation with Bob and saying, I'm conscious that this led to an argument and I wish it hadn't, but this isn't the first time that I'd noticed it. And I just wanted to highlight a few examples that have made me feel uncomfortable so that we can move forward. And then if you've publicly sort of sat down, had that conversation, Alex and Bob together, then hopefully people feel then more comfortable around them because they don't feel like something else is just going to blow up again, which I'm sure is probably how their colleagues are feeling.
There's also, I guess, another workaround is if people, not everyone has the, confidence to address things directly. Yeah. I guess you could go to HR or your manager and have a bit of a mediation.
Yeah, I'd say going to your manager is probably a sensible thing. And also being sure in that scenario that, it wasn't something that he was working on before or something along those lines, because he could just be being really dramatic and protective because he feels embarrassed because he's been called out about it.
Yeah.
Or it could have been a genuine mistake.
Yeah. I once had a mediation session with one of my colleagues that we'd been working together. And it's really interesting. Like at the time, I just remember feeling so frustrated by it. But in hindsight, senior leadership were like pitting us against each other.
Oh, right.
So now I think sometimes you don't realise at the time.
What was the mediation session about?
We were both we were in different teams but working in a similar area. And it was a lot of like ownership of who was trying to own the area a bit more. So we were both the same level, but I guess one of us wanted to take leadership and we wanted the other to like just follow.
Yeah.
And we had quite different views on stuff. And I think a lot of it was, I think I look back on that and I remember at the time, I actually left the business soon after because I just felt like I wasn't really listened to. But actually, in hindsight, I think that could have been handled a little bit better.
Yeah, and I think, there's managing conflict when you're the person experiencing it, and then there's also managing conflict as a leader. Like if you see it happening in your team, like how you deal with that. And I think that's quite a tricky thing to try to overcome. Like I remember a specific example of it. And again, it comes back to the type of conflict that it is, because I think if it's conflict professionally, like the thing that you just described, or where somebody's taking credit for somebody else's work, or it's something very work related.
Yes.
Communication style maybe, then getting involved is probably the right thing to do to make sure that there is a proper outcome that is right for your team or your business. But I think the one place where it's very difficult to intervene as a leader is when it's social conflict. So like two people just don't like each other because what can you do? I remember managing a team member and she came to me and she said, I'm really struggling to work with this person. And I asked why. I'd seen it happen, but it very much emerged that it was just that they were two very different people. Neither of them were doing anything wrong. And she was like, can you talk to them? And I said, no. I think this is something that you need to have the first conversation about, because I think it's because you're two very different people, very different ways of working. And I think it's best that you try to find some common ground and actually try to overcome this yourselves. And then I was like, and then if that doesn't work, I'm here. We'll talk about it. I can support another conversation. But I was like, if I weighed in now, it makes a mountain out of a molehill.
Yeah. There's also, I think sometimes it's to the point about working styles. I fucking love talking about values, core values, things that are really important to me. And I did an exercise with my team once where we went through loads of different values and worked out, I got people to go pick a list of like what's important. So fairness, fun, creativity, all sorts of stuff. And then I got everyone to like whittle the list down and down and down to have 3 things in the workplace that were like so important to them. And what we found out is, say, one of mine, for example, is variety. Like, whereas a colleague might be routine and consistency.
Very different, yeah.
So actually, not that either is right or wrong in how we approach it. We just approach things differently. And I think sometimes understanding how colleagues approach things or their style can help you feel less like it's a personal attack. It's like a different style. So then work out how you can use that to your advantage. Like, how can they take on some of the maybe more slightly monotonous routine things, whereas you can do things that are a bit more sporadic. I think sometimes
understanding differences,
the conflict can lead to better like working environments. I guess in terms of when we see conflict in teams, often it is things like it might be personality clashes, or you might see a drop in productivity, collaboration, might see more people not showing up at work, whether that's physically or even emotionally. But what steps can you take as a manager to manage conflict? What would you suggest?
So breaking it down into those two things, and I think if it's very social, then encouraging people to deal with it themselves. If it is from a team conflict perspective, if it's between two people, then I think it's whether you mediate a conversation or whether you encourage a conversation to happen. But if it's general team conflict where it's more than two people, I think then you need to look at how you can facilitate a better working environment, whether it's doing an exercise like you suggested where it's about values and then you point out the differences between people and you help overcome it, or you have an open conversation saying like, I've noticed some signs of people not getting on as well or not being as productive, or maybe you can partially put it on yourself and say, what can I do to make this situation better? I think it's much better to tackle it head on than it is to bury your head in the sand.
I wonder as well if how you approach it varies at the level you're at. So yes. I would want, for me, I think if someone's a much more junior member of the team, I would probably expect that they might need a little bit more support. Whereas if someone's like head of director level, if you get to that level and you don't know how to speak with people.
Yeah, that's a really fair point. I think it can happen very often that at the head of or director level, it's more that their behaviour might have caused conflict with somebody else because they're less aware of how they're coming across, rather than them saying, oh, somebody has chosen to have beef with me and I don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah.
You're more likely to have it the other way around.
Kind of see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Do you think there's ever ways to completely prevent conflict, or is that human nature?
I think it's human nature. I also think that an environment without any form of conflict probably isn't naturally going to be the best environment, because think about a relationship when a couple never argues. There's probably some stuff bubbling under the surface that has just never been addressed. And I think it's really similar in working environments. You're going to have so many different people, different backgrounds, different viewpoints, that conflict is going to naturally arise. And if you create an environment where it always seems so serene and that conflict can never come up, then I think people actually end up less happy in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, diversity of thought I think is so important in the workplace. And also, you don't want to live in an echo chamber where your opinion is the only opinion. Like, you're never going to learn or grow.
Disagreement's natural. Like, not everybody is going to agree on the same thing. And then if there is disagreement, the likelihood is that some people will take it better than others and some people will back down and others won't. And that can eventually lead to conflict. But creating a safe environment where discussion is encouraged, I think, can help things not come to a head in such an extreme way. Yeah,
whereas there's a big difference between me going, you're wrong, versus, let me challenge you on that, or could you explain that a little bit more?
What made you think that? What contributed to those beliefs, or you thinking that that's the right way of doing it?
Yeah. In terms of managing a team though, what advice would you give for creating that safe space? I think it's one thing to say it, another thing to do it.
I think it's something that I haven't always gotten right. I think it depends on the kind of people that you've got in a team or you've got in a company. I think I've definitely learned a lot through running a company and having lots of different personality types over time. I think the most important thing you can do as a leader, whether you're managing somebody or whether you're leading a company, is make sure that when someone is disagreeing with you, whether it's gently or whether it's more like, no, I really don't think that's right, that you don't shut it down straight away. So you role model that behaviour of a discussion. So you go, why do you think that? And you concede something. You go, okay, I still think it's this, but I can see why. I can see your point on that, so we'll adjust X, Y, or Z. It's almost heavily exhibiting the behaviours that you want other people to have. And then when you see other people behaving like that, encouraging that behaviour. So sort of reinforcing it and saying, I think you handled that really well. Or to somebody who's not, saying, maybe next time it might be worth approaching that situation in a slightly different way, and kind of consistently giving that feedback. I think it's a really hard thing to get right, because you also don't want everything to be a discussion. Sometimes somebody just needs to take a decision and go, this is the way we're doing it. Otherwise you get bogged down in everyone's opinion counting equally, when actually you've employed somebody to be the expert and to make decisions. And if everyone feels like they can chime in and their opinion's going to be listened to, that also slows the business down.
But I think that's also part of it, isn't it? It's like making it clear on when you're the decision maker and when it is
discursive.
Yeah.
I think there's a very big difference between that. And I think that's something that I have struggled to always get right. And it's something that I'm always learning about. And like, how do you not become a democracy, but also not a dictatorship?
But I think that, just to touch on that briefly about the point about demonstrating that behaviour, like if any role I've ever been in, when I've seen that demonstrated is when I felt my most ambitious, driven, like safe, especially like, you know, a lot of the work I do is very creative and we have to come up with, you know, lots of ideas and have lots of brainstorms. And if you feel like you're not in that safe environment, then your ideas are you just absolutely shrink yourself.
Yeah, and you're not going to feel as inspired to come up with lots of ideas and test it and, you know, have the freedom to say some things that might not be great, but in a way to try and get you to the great idea at the end of it.
And actually, some of the best work has come from saying something stupid. Yeah. People go, well, hang on, let's actually think about if that did happen.
Yeah, and you don't want people to feel stupid doing that.
No.
It's really important.
I feel like we've covered a lot today.
Yes.
From handling difficult colleagues to managing teams to
having our own little conflict.
No, we disagreed a lot today.
No, it's been really interesting chatting through. I think also just the distinctions between social conflict in a work environment and like actual work conflict as well. And obviously sometimes the two of them can blur, but I think it really does make for, when you think about it in that capacity, it makes you approach conflict differently.
And I think as we're discussing as well, I'm realising how normal it is to have conflict, and it's not always a bad thing.
It's like thinking the number of times that you've disagreed with a friend and that's been totally fine and you've moved on, you've had different opinions, you're still friends.
Yeah.
I think those kind of things.
Even more so with family.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, family, that's why I would never call work a family, because it's too dysfunctional.
If I behaved how I did my family at work.
So how can our listeners reach out and share their own stories or ask us questions?
If you have any questions or want to share a story, which we love to hear, feel free to reach out to us on Instagram at workingonit.pod or email us hello@workingonit.show. What are we talking about next time?
So next time on the podcast, we're talking about changing careers.
Oh.
Yeah, bit of a squiggly career conversation.
Oh, God, I'm going to thrive in this conversation. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Until then, keep working on it.